Okay, so this is the Bible study for Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. And the text says, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on the journey I am taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. All right. So this is sort of a transitional story, but a very important transition, because we know that Jacob is on his way to get a wife from his, well, really from his cousins, I guess, from his uncle's house, and he's just stolen the blessing from Esau, and Esau's vowed to kill him, and um, Rebecca said, well, he needs to go find a. We were talking about wives and Esau's wives that were causing problems with the family, and Rebecca said, well, I don't want Jacob to get a wife from among these folks, and so she told Isaac, and they blessed him and sent him away. So that's kind of where we're at. Actually, number one says, "What did we learn about in the last 2 week Bible study?" And that's pretty much what we learned about. Jacob, stole the blessing from Esau, and this is how we kind of ended it. Remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And if you do, when you do, you will find that that was question number one. And as it usually is, because even though we take the Bible section by section when we're studying in our Bible studies, we recognize that it wasn't written a section at a time, and that context helps us understand what we're reading. If we take the text out of context, then we are going to miss something about what we're learning. So we almost always do some kind of a brief review. It also catches you up if you weren't here in the last Bible study, although I would encourage you, particularly on video, to go back and watch those old videos to catch up. But yeah, here we are. So then number two says, what happens now in 28:10 through 15? A, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. And that's what it says in verse 10. So remember, Beersheba was called as it was because of God's provision of water through the wells. And Isaac, when he was digging out the wells that Abraham had dug, but whose servants had dug, and people were clogging them up, and he kept looking to find water that people didn't fight over, and that was called Beersheba. So now Jacob's leaving Beersheba, which is the land where Isaac has settled, and he's setting out for Haran, which is the land where Abraham's family has been from, where Rebekah has come from, and that's what's going on. B, when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night, as one would do. Um, and So it says, C, he took a stone and put it under his head and lay down to sleep. So he was obviously staying at the Motel 6. Um, because that's the level of accommodations. That sounds a little snobby, doesn't it? A Motel 6 is fine if you want to hear what your neighbors are doing. Anyway, um, so his accommodations obviously were not quite as nice as what we commonly probably expect if we're traveling. But he took a stone and put it under his head and lay down to sleep. D, he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on earth with its top reaching to heaven. So now we're getting into the meat of this. So while he was sleeping there with his head on a rock, he had a dream and saw a stairway to heaven, apparently, long before the classic rock song. E, angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And so basically, angels from heaven were coming down to earth and returning to heaven on this stairway that was sort of a pathway between heaven and earth, and the Lord was standing at the top of it. F says, there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So I'll just tell you what I think is significant. We're going to continue to talk about the significance of this and how Jacob kind of responds. Um, but this appears to be the moment where God becomes the God of Jacob and not just the God of Abraham and Isaac. So later on in text that we'll read, God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When God appears here to Jacob, he said, I'm the God of your father Abraham and your father Isaac. I'm the God of Isaac. Um, and so it's almost like I've been the God of your grandfather and your father. I'm ready now to be your God too, if you will have me. And I would say this, that as somebody who was raised in the church, that is an important transition, because I was raised in the church by parents who had chosen to make our God their God, and grandparents who, even previous to that, had chosen to make our God their God. When you grow up in the church, there's a tendency sort of to, just assume, well, God's God, he's my God, whatever, even if we haven't really had interaction with him. And I can tell you that I did not have a very real interaction with God until I was about 21 years old. Um, and, I learned about God. I knew about God, but I was at a place where, and by the way, I don't think you have to wait till that time. I don't think you should wait till that time. I just think that for whatever reason, I knew what God, I even believe that God spoke to me and sort of called me, not through an audible voice, but through feelings. And I believe He was trying to express Himself to me from a very young age. but I don't believe that I turned around and sort of really listened and said, okay, God, I'm ready to do whatever you say. God, I need your help and I need to have sort of an interactive relationship here. I didn't say that. I didn't realize that that was something I needed or wanted until I was about 21 years old. And then when I did that, God answered. And the reason that I reached out to God was because He was the God of John and Georgiana, because He was the God of Jim and Brenda. And so when He spoke to me, He really didn't have to say, "I'm the Lord, the God of Johnny and Georgiana, the God of Jim and Brenda." And I want to bless you and I want to be with you and I want to watch over you and I have a plan for your life. He didn't have to say that because I knew that He was the God of them. I wasn't even sure if He was real until I needed Him to be the God of me, and I cried out to Him. So I cried out to Him at that point, and He was there. And we're going to talk a little bit more because I really, in a lot of ways, sort of identify with this story right here of Jacob. Um, so we'll talk a little bit more about my testimony as we go along here. But I would just say that this seems to be a transition point where Jacob, up to this point, was sort of doing the things that he knew he should do, and his parents told him to do, and maybe sometimes was led astray by things his parents told him to do. I don't know. But at this point, we really see that God becomes his God. And honestly, as we walk along here, we find, I believe, that Jacob comes to know God in perhaps a way that Abraham and Isaac before him had not fully known God over time, and sort of that's not to criticize the faith of Abraham or Isaac at all. In fact, I would say that it's harder to put your trust in God and follow God when it's when you have less information, are less, when you know less about Him. And I would say that Jacob is building on what his family's interactions with God has been, but this is just his first sort of interaction that we see, and then we find him, wrestling with God and things like that in a way that he really seems to latch on to God in a way that I don't think Abraham and Isaac did. And maybe that's just my idea, and maybe that's not something that's regularly taught. I don't know, but Abraham is obviously really celebrated by Israel, and rightly so. But it just really feels like Jacob comes to know God, and we learn more about Jacob's relationship with God than we ever really knew about Abraham and Isaac. So anyway, and it begins here. Um, Number three, what did Jacob do when he awoke, according to 28:16 through 19? So there's a few things, and some of them are kind of funny. A, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. So he has this dream, sees God, and sees the angels coming and going on this stairway, and here it is in this place, and he says God was here all along and I just didn't know it. Now, as we talk about this, we're going to talk about, did that make that place special? Was God there in that place in a special way that He was perhaps not in other places? And I I don't think so. I just think that that was a place where Jacob became more acutely aware, or actually finally aware, that God was present in places where he was, even when he didn't know that God was present there. And I'm not. So I think that realization was a very positive realization. Now, I'm not sure everything that Jacob does after this is necessarily a positive, because I think it's sometimes what we do as church people when we all of a sudden experience God in a place, then that place takes on a sacredness of it, in a way where we are suddenly aware of God's presence in that place, but still missing his presence in other places where he also is. And we could perhaps have a dream or a vision, or wake up and say, God was here and I didn't realize it. Oh, God was here and I didn't realize it. And sometimes I think, designating a place where we've had an experience with God almost causes us to look for that experience in that place, but still not look for that place in these places where we would not have expected it. And so yeah, I'm not. There's like a mixed bag with this realization, I think, and how we respond to it. And I think, by the way, I'm not criticizing Jacob, because I think honestly he responds to it exactly the way most of us do. When we've had the reason altars are so significant for people, and maybe for some of us have lost significance, is because historically the altars at the front of the church are places where people met God. Early in my faith, I lived very close to the church, and I came in daily at 5 a.m. It was literally like a minute and a half drive from my house to where our church used to be. And I wasn't the pastor. I was newly on staff, and I had a key, and I came in, and the pastor was there, and he was praying in his office, and I went in to the sanctuary and prayed at the altar, because I had had amazing experiences with God, and it was a place where I expected to meet God, and it was a place where, frankly, I had less distractions, because even once I was on staff full time and had an office, praying in my office was difficult because I had my computer and things like that that would easily distract me. Things to do splayed out on the desk. Um, I always had to turn around and kneel at my chair, which over time my knees began to fall asleep and ache and things like that, and so I don't kneel quite as often now as I used to. But I would just say, sort of, for some of us, a place where we have met God before can be a positive thing, because it can increase our expectation of finding Him there. It can increase our focus and our really pointed, um, you know, anticipation, I guess, of finding Him there. Um, but also it can teach us accidentally that that's the only place that we can find him, and we find ourselves you know not expecting, oh, God was here and I didn't know it. Um, so B, he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And so there was a certain level of reverence and expectation that, like he said, this is the place where God comes and goes, where his messengers come and go. I can remember in my first year of ministry as the lead pastor at our church, I preached on this text, and I set one of those, pavers, those landscaping bricks that we have outside. I set it up on its end on the stage and poured cooking oil on it, and stained the carpet. And that stain remained there in the middle of the stage for a long time. And, as a young pastor, some people say, well, you stained the carpet. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I did. Pretty new carpet, whatever. And then I came to think that even after we moved the stone, that there was something special about the fact that the oil stain was there, until some helpful thrift store worker said, I think I can get that out, and got the oil out of the carpet. And I came in and I was like, where's the oil stain? And, there was a tendency in my mind and in my heart to say that was so special, and God's presence isn't here anymore. And that's just silly, right? But this is how we think of things, because we um, well, we kind of box God in and try to control where he comes and goes. And to me, the greatest revelation of what Jacob saw was that God comes and goes wherever he wants to, even when we don't know, even when we're not paying attention. And so the fact that he would sort of thereafter create sort of a religious place, um, that expects God to come and go there and doesn't expect God to come and go elsewhere is probably completely contrary to what God was trying to show him. But it's the kind of thing we do, isn't it? C. I think, well, did I say this already? He took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up a pillar and poured oil on it. D, he called the place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. So we again see sort of the people of God renaming cities and places that already existed based on their experience with God, which I don't have a problem with that at all. Um, and much like I began the story talking about Beersheba, was that sort of place that had been renamed based on Isaac's experience with God there, and God's provision for him through the wells. Number 4, was this place a church or designed worship space? Yes, no, explain. And I think this is kind of a trick question because the answer is on that day, obviously not. That's why Jacob did not expect to see God there, because it was not the designated place where we're planning to see God. But thereafter, Jacob sort of designated it that way, and it did become a significant place of worship for the people of God after that. And so, um, I would say this, that there's something to that we don't tell God where to show up. He shows up. And is it appropriate or okay for us to sort of designate and celebrate a place where he showed up? Well, yeah, I mean, maybe it is. Sort of those pillars are things that God at times in the history of Israel commanded Israel to set up, or piles of rocks so that they would remember what God did and what he said there, and they could tell their children. And so things like that are significant. So returning to visit a place of significance where God has showed up is not a bad thing. So all of the other things that I said about it, it's not necessarily a bad thing until it becomes the box that God has to be in our life. That's when it becomes a bad thing. When it becomes a place where we celebrate that we have heard from God and we know that God will speak to us there because he has before, that can be a good thing. When it becomes a place that we go and we tell our children, this is the place where God spoke to me and this is what he said, that's a good thing. But when it becomes a place where we say, well, I'm not in that place, so God's not speaking to me, then, well, maybe God was present in the other place too, and we were just not aware of it. And so I think there's a balance there. There's a give and take that we need to be careful of. So the answer is no, it wasn't a designated worship space, and the significance of that is that God can show up anywhere, and sometimes we're not aware of it. Um, the answer is also that yes, it became a designated worship space because it was the place where God had met with his people. So it begins this discussion of Do we designate the space where God will meet with us, or does He designate the space that God will meet with, that He will meet with us? Um, and obviously, in this case, He designates the space. We don't say this is the church. God, come here. He says, I want to meet with you here. You come here. And so, I think that's significant in the thought of church planting and where God wants to reach His people. We have a tendency to find a nice place that we think will attract the right people or whatever, and say, God, show up here. And I wonder how many times He's calling us into a different place, and He says, no. You don't tell me where I'm going to go. I'm telling you where I want to be, talking to you, talking to this community. Anyway, that's a thought that I had. Has God ever been present in a place you didn't expect and you were not, at least at first, aware of it? And I say at least at first because if you were not ever aware of it, you can't answer this question. The only way you can answer this question is if you eventually did become aware of it, and realize that He was there in that place and you never had realized it until He made Himself known to you. And I think that the answer for all of us should be yes. And if it's not yes, it's only because we never became aware of it, that we were so not expecting Him there and really not looking for Him or listening for Him there that we never did become aware of it. Does this suggest anything about how we should live or behave in places we consider unholy or not sanctified or set apart for God? Yes, God is there. It suggests that we should be careful. When I was a college and career pastor, I had some new believers in my ministry, and they said whenever they went to church, their friends would say hi to God for me, and they were like, "You can say hi yourself. He's right here." You don't have to. We don't have to go to church for me to say hi to God for you, because God can be said hi to right here. And if you're so worried about Him, knowing that you're thinking about Him, you should probably say hi to Him even just now, right where you're at. And so I think we ought to take more consideration for God's presence in places that we don't expect Him, because one, He knows what we're doing. So if we think that He's not there, that is a dangerous thing. And two, because He's in places where we don't expect Him to be, and He may be leading us to interact with people we don't expect Him to lead us to, because we didn't even know He was going to be there. When we walk through a place that is incredibly ungodly and unholy, then we become the presence of God's body, the body of Christ, right there. And God is going with us into that situation in that place. And we need to be aware of what He might want to say or do in and through us in that place. And so we do need to consider that. Number 5, what did Jacob do next in 28, 20 through 22? A, he made a vow. Yes. B, he said, if God. Now, here's where I was going to say, when I said this sort of, I identify with this story in a very personal way. It's because when I met God at the age of 21, I um, I met Him in a place of my need, and I said, God, if you can take care of this, if you can fix this, heal this, um, then I'll know you're real and I'll serve you. And I said, if God. Now, I would say for a lot of people that's making deals with God is not wise, as if we have sort of some authority or pull to like bribe God. That's the way it feels when I listen to my story. It's like, oh, God, you really need to come through on this or else you're losing me. And by the way, that wasn't my attitude when I said it. I was broken and hurting and needed Him. But telling the story in retrospect, I can see how somebody would sort of be manipulating or bribing God. I was just in a place where I really didn't know if he exists or even knew where I was. I didn't expect to meet him where I was. And I was laying not with my head on a stone, but I was laying with my head on, if you've ever been to jail, they gave me an orange jumpsuit and little brown, like my kids would call them slides now, but they're like slippers. I guess you can't hurt anybody or kill anybody or hurt yourself with them. They take all your clothes, they take everything out of your pockets. You wear this jumpsuit, you wear these brown sandals, and they put me in a concrete room with a metal toilet, with a concrete bench, and that's all that was in there. And I was in there for 8 hours, and I was exhausted and trying to sleep off drunkenness. And so, what did I do? First of all, the benches were occupied, in some cases with shady characters that I didn't want to be next to. So you turn your slides upside down and you can fit them in, so they made kind of a thicker, and that's what my head was laying on, not a stone. I don't know if it's any better. I don't know what I had stepped on that was on the back of my head. At that point, I'm not sure I really cared. I got in the car after I got out, and my buddy said, "You stink," and it wasn't me. It was whatever I put on. I don't know if they washed that jumpsuit. Like, I don't know what I smelled like, but here I was laying my head, and that's how I met God. That's when who would have known he was there? I didn't even know he really existed. And I didn't think he was there, but after I thought it through for a while, I thought he was the only answer. So I was in a place of need, so I called out to him. If God, if you're really real and you can get me out of this, I'll serve you. See, I'll tell you here in a minute that why in humility, if you say that, if it's not in manipulation or in a place of sort of like you think you're holding something over God, that's not good. But in humility, why I do think that this can be a good, if God can be a good thing. See, he promised that the Lord would be his God, and he designated the stone in the place to be God's house. So he said, if God, then you'll be my God. If you do this, if you get me through this, if you provide for me and care for me, then you will be my God. And this will be your house. I'll come back here and worship you. Now, whether that was an important part of it or not, I don't know. We already covered that. But I would say the reason I think it was okay in humility to say, if God comes through, then the reason I feel like it's okay to say that is because God has already promised he would. Like before Jacob says this, God says, I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac, and this is what I'm going to do for you. And Jacob says, all right, if that's what you're going to do for me, then this is what I'll do. And and So God has already promised. In my case, whether I realized it or not, God had already promised. God had already given me a promise of what he wanted to do in my life. Both generally in scripture and specifically, I believe, for me, he had already spoken. And so it wasn't like I was challenging him because he'd already said he would, whether I realized it or remembered it or not. And then D is a little bit tougher. He committed to give God a tenth of all that you give me. Isn't that interesting? So we talked about, Abraham and Melchizedek, or Abram and Melchizedek being the first tithe. But here Jacob says, okay, if you're going to be my God, then if you're going to do all this for me, you'll be my God. And this will be the place that I worship you, and I will give you a tenth of everything you give me. And so this was a very first and foundational commitment that Jacob made to God. And I would say that for a lot of us, it trails. And I think it trails because maybe we're not recognizing what God has really done for us. Because if we did, Jacob realized that he's promised to give me everything I need. If that's the case, then I'll give him a tenth of everything he gives me back as an offering. Um, Number 6 says, do you think there's a problem with taking a vow that says if God? We've been talking about this. And so I don't, as long as it's not something that's made in arrogance where I'm holding something over God, but it's in desperation and he's already promised. Number 7 says, if God offers you an agreement or a covenant like this, and he has, would you commit to serve him, including giving him a tenth of all that he gives you? Because I think this is one of those things that we skip over that, we ignore that. But that was foundational. That was from the beginning for Jacob, because he was recognizing that God has promised to care for me, give me everything I needed. And I've said, then he's going to be my God. If this is his promise, I'm not going to, where am I going to get an offer like that? He's going to be my God, and I'm going to worship him. And part of my worship is going to be giving him a tenth of everything I have. And is that the commitment we've made to him? I don't understand how we can make any other commitment to him, how we can try to latch on to his blessings without being willing to recognize that he's the one that gave them to us by giving an offering back. I don't understand it. But it's really common. And I think honestly, it's because people really don't have this sort of encounter with God. Because if they did, he would be worthy of it all.